January 1994 started like any other night for Houston police, but for Officer Guy Gaddis, 24, newly married and 2 years into his dream career, it ended in tragedy. Responding to a robbery call, he made an arrest that seemed routine. But in the back of his patrol car sat Edgar Tamayo Arias, a 26-year-old Mexican national with a hidden pistol, and in a single devastating moment, that weapon changed everything. 3 shots to the back of Gaddis's head turned a routine night shift into a nightmare that shook Houston, ignited international outrage and triggered nearly 2 decades of legal battles. Tamayo Arias wasn't just any criminal. He was a drifter with a violent past whose actions pitted Texas justice against international law, culminating in one of the most controversial executions in recent history. To understand how this tragedy unfolded and why the world watched as Tamayo faced the gurney in Huntsville, we need to start at the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell. This is a story that stays with you long after the credits roll. Edgar Tamayo Arias was born on July 22, 1967, in Mexico, and like many young men from poor rural areas at the time, his life was shaped early on by hardship and limited opportunities. His family background was modest, and while his parents would later testify that he never lacked food or shelter during his childhood, the environment around him was far from nurturing. Opportunities for education were scarce, and his schooling was limited, leaving him with few tools to carve out a better path for himself. By the time he reached his early 20s, Tamayo had already developed a reputation for impulsive behavior and poor decisions that would chart the course of his life toward trouble. In his early 20s, Tamayo made the decision to cross illegally into the United States, a choice that, at first, promised the possibility of work and a new start but instead plunged him deeper into instability. Once in the U.S., he spent time in California, where his actions quickly drew the attention of law enforcement. Court records reveal that Tamayo was convicted of robbery, serving a 3-year prison term in California from 1991 to 1993 before being released on parole. Though he carried no official prison record in Texas at the time of his arrest for capital murder, his years in California hinted at a pattern of violent and reckless conduct that foreshadowed what was to come. By the time he relocated to Texas, Tamayo's life was marked by a cycle of unstable, low-income jobs and growing connections to criminal activity. He lived in the shadows, working menial labor but also spending his free time in the company of people who, like him, existed on the margins of society. Neighbors and witnesses would later testify about his behavior, which often turned violent. Reports emerged of Tamayo threatening bodily harm to multiple people, firing a gun recklessly in a mobile home park, and even aiming shots toward nearby mobile homes where families lived. On another occasion, he was seen chasing a man with a firearm, further solidifying his image as a volatile and dangerous figure. These incidents painted a picture of a man whose life was spiraling out of control long before the fateful night in 1994. On the night of January 31, 1994, in southwest Houston, what began as a routine patrol for a young police officer would quickly unravel into one of the most shocking tragedies in the city's history. Just after midnight, Officer Guy P. Gaddis, a 24-year-old Houston police officer who had been serving the community for barely 2 years, was flagged down outside a nightclub by a frantic man who reported that he had just been robbed. The victim pointed toward the suspects, and Officer Gatis acted swiftly, locating 2 men in a nearby parking lot, 26-year-old Edgar Tamayo Arias and another accomplice. Calm and professional, Gaddis detained both men, performed a search and immediately found incriminating evidence. Tamayo was in possession of the victim's watch, while further investigation revealed he was also wearing the man's necklace. With this discovery, Gaddis had more than enough cause to arrest the pair, placing both men in handcuffs and seating them in the back of his marked patrol car. By routine assignment, Tamayo sat directly behind Officer Gatis, only a thin partition separating the officer from the man who, in moments, would alter countless lives. What Officer Gatis did not know was that Tamayo, despite being searched, still had a concealed pistol tucked into his waistband, a weapon he somehow managed to keep hidden throughout the arrest. As Gaddis began driving away from the scene, he decided to stop at a convenience store to make a phone call. During those brief minutes while Gaddis was outside the patrol car, Tamayo whispered to the other suspect that he still had his gun. Despite being handcuffed, he managed to maneuver the weapon from his waistband, concealing it in preparation for an escape. When Gaddis returned to the vehicle and resumed driving toward the jail, Tamayo's anger simmered. Later, during questioning, he would tell investigators that he was furious at the officer for refusing to let him stop and leave his keys with his wife before being transported to jail. A small request, but one that Tamayo would irrationally twist into justification for deadly violence. With the patrol car rolling through the Houston streets, Tamayo shifted in the back seat, turning himself sideways to gain leverage. Suddenly, in a burst of violence, he pulled out the pistol and aimed it toward the front of the car. Firing 6 shots through the plexiglass divider, 3 of the bullets struck Officer Gatis in the back of the head, killing him almost instantly. The patrol car veered out of control, ran off the road and crashed into a nearby house, its headlights cutting a violent arc across the quiet neighborhood before slamming into the structure. Tamayo, still in handcuffs, kicked out one of the broken windows, crawled through and fled into the night, leaving behind the mortally wounded officer. The escape was short-lived. Just a few blocks away, officers responding to the crash spotted Tamayo and quickly apprehended him. He was still wearing the robbery victim's necklace around his neck, carrying the stolen watch, and with the pistol now out in the open. His hands remained cuffed, a chilling reminder that even restrained, he had managed to carry out one of the most cold-blooded murders of a law enforcement officer in Houston's history. Officer Gaddis was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the injuries were catastrophic. Doctors pronounced him dead upon arrival, the news devastating his young wife, his family, and the Houston Police Department. At only 24 years old, Gaddis had already built a reputation as a promising officer, respected by his peers and admired by his loved ones, and now his life had been violently cut short by a man he had taken into custody during the course of a routine arrest. The murder sent shockwaves not only through the police community but across the city of Houston. The senselessness of the act, the execution-style killing of an officer who had followed procedure, who had done everything by the book, was almost unbearable to those who knew him. For the Gaddis family, who had only just celebrated his marriage and his rising career, the loss was a devastating blow. For his fellow officers, it was a grim reminder of the dangers of policing and the unpredictability of suspects. And for the city at large, it was the beginning of a decades-long saga that would intertwine questions of justice, international law, and the death penalty. In November 1994, the case of Edgar Tamayo Arias finally reached the courtroom of Harris County, Texas, where the stakes were as high as they could possibly be, given that he stood accused of the capital murder of Houston police officer Gaddis, a crime that shocked not only the city but also drew the attention of law enforcement officials across the state. The trial was lengthy and intense, with prosecutors methodically presenting the harrowing sequence of events from the night of January 31, 1994, when Officer Gatis, while transporting Tamayo in his patrol car, was ambushed from behind by the very man he had placed under arrest. Prosecutors emphasized that Tamayo had been searched but had managed to keep a small handgun hidden, and once in the back of the police cruiser, he fired several rounds into the back of the unsuspecting officer's head, killing him almost instantly. They painted this act as not just a cold-blooded murder, but as a calculated betrayal of the trust and authority of the law, committed against an officer who was simply carrying out his duty. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on the principle that murdering a police officer while in the line of duty was one of the gravest offenses imaginable. Assistant district attorneys argued that Tamayo knew exactly what he was doing when he concealed the firearm, waited for the right moment, and then executed Officer Gaddis while handcuffed, an act that revealed premeditation rather than desperation. They told the jury that this was not a crime of impulse, nor an act of panic, but instead the deliberate killing of a protector of the community, and for that, Texas law demanded the ultimate punishment. The fact that Officer Gaddis had not only placed Tamayo under arrest but was also transporting him for booking after a robbery call made the betrayal even more striking, underscoring that Tamayo had turned the officer's routine duty into a fatal trap. On the other hand, the defense team struggled to mitigate the weight of the evidence stacked against Tamayo. They did not deny that a crime had occurred, but they attempted to shift the jury's focus toward Tamayo's background, bringing up issues that would later surface more strongly on appeal. His lawyers raised questions about his difficult upbringing in Mexico, marked by poverty, limited access to education, and alleged exposure to abuse, all of which, they argued, shaped a man of limited understanding and poor judgment. They also tried to highlight his mental health issues and intellectual limitations, suggesting that he did not have the emotional or psychological stability to fully comprehend the long-term consequences of his actions. However, at trial, these arguments were quickly overshadowed by the brutal clarity of the crime itself. The murder of a young Houston police officer, shot in the back of the head while serving his city. After hearing both sides, the jury reached their decision in November 1994. They found Edgar Tamayo Arias guilty of capital murder and delivered the harshest sentence permitted by Texas law: death by lethal injection. The jury's choice reflected the gravity with which society viewed the killing of a peace officer, particularly under circumstances that involved deception, violence, and betrayal. Following the conviction, the case proceeded into its automatic appeals process. In December 1996, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the highest court in the state for criminal matters, carefully reviewed the trial proceedings but ultimately upheld the death sentence, reinforcing that the jury's verdict was legally sound and that the punishment matched the severity of the crime. Although appeals continued over the years and questions about international law and Tamayo's rights as a Mexican national later became focal points, the conviction and sentence from the 1994 trial remained the cornerstone of the case against him. This stage of the story was not just about a legal process, it was about how the justice system responded to the murder of an officer sworn to protect and serve. For the prosecution, Tamayo represented a man who had made calculated choices that ended a promising young officer's life. For the defense, he was a product of hardship and poor mental health, whose tragic background should have been weighed more heavily. In the end, however, the courtroom consensus was clear. Society could not tolerate such a violent breach of trust, and the punishment handed down was meant to send a message that the deliberate killing of law enforcement officers would be met with the strongest penalty the law could provide. After his 1994 conviction and death sentence, Edgar Tamayo Arias's legal battle entered a new and highly complex phase that stretched far beyond the Texas courts. By the late 1990s, his attorneys began arguing that a fundamental error had occurred at the very beginning of the case. He had not been informed of his right, under international law, to contact the Mexican consulate after his arrest. This right is guaranteed under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations of 1963, a treaty signed and ratified by both Mexico and the United States. The treaty requires that when a foreign national is arrested in another country, the authorities must promptly inform them of their right to seek assistance from their home nation's consulate. Tamayo's defense argued that if he had been given this opportunity, the Mexican government could have provided immediate legal assistance, investigated mitigating evidence about his troubled upbringing in Mexico, and potentially altered the course of his trial and sentencing. Mexico quickly took up his case, and Tamayo's situation became part of a much larger international legal battle. His name appeared alongside dozens of other Mexican nationals in the historic Avena case, which Mexico brought before the International Court of Justice (ICJ) in The Hague in the early 2000s. In 2004, the ICJ ruled in Mexico's favor, declaring that the United States had violated the Vienna Convention in multiple cases, including Tamayo's, and ordered that U.S. courts provide meaningful judicial review and reconsideration of these convictions and sentences. This ruling placed tremendous diplomatic and legal pressure on Texas and other states with Mexican nationals on death row. But the American legal system responded differently. In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Medellin versus Texas, a case involving another Mexican national from the Avena group. In its decision, the court acknowledged the ICJ ruling but held that international court decisions are not automatically binding within the United States unless Congress passes specific legislation enforcing them. This meant that states like Texas were under no obligation to reopen cases, even in light of international law. For Tamayo, this ruling dealt a devastating blow, as it effectively closed one of his strongest avenues for relief. The case, however, did not fade quietly. The Mexican government, through its consulate and diplomatic channels, made repeated appeals for Tamayo's sentence to be reconsidered, insisting that his right to consular access had been violated. Human rights organizations, legal scholars, and even the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, joined the chorus of voices urging Texas to grant at least a stay of execution. Kerry argued that failing to comply with the Vienna Convention could put U.S. citizens abroad at risk, as it would weaken the reciprocal protection Americans depend on if they. Despite the mounting international pressure, Texas officials remained resolute. The Office of the Texas Attorney General and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected requests for reconsideration, maintaining that Tamayo had been afforded due process over nearly 2 decades of appeals and that the rights of the victim, Officer Gatis, and his grieving family must not be overshadowed. The prosecution framed the appeals as stalling tactics, while supporters of Tamayo saw them as a last stand for justice under international law. This clash of perspectives fueled a growing diplomatic strain between the United States and Mexico, with Mexican officials warning that the execution of Tamayo without proper review would damage bilateral relations. Protesters gathered outside embassies, consulates, and Texas government buildings, holding signs demanding justice and compliance with the ICJ's decision. Newspapers across both nations covered the story, framing it as not just the fate of one man but as a test of how the United States balanced state sovereignty against international legal obligations. In addition to the consular rights issue, Tamayo also filed other appeals in state and federal court, including a claim that he was ineligible for execution by reason of mental retardation. All of his appeals were denied. A spokesperson for Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott noted that at the time of his arrest, Tamayo was afforded the rights of U.S. citizens, including the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. The spokesperson stated that upon hearing those rights recited to him in Spanish, Tamayo waived them and opted to confess to Gaddis's murder. In late 2013, when Harris County prosecutors requested an execution date for Tamayo, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry sent the judge a letter asking him not to set an execution date because Tamayo was a Mexican citizen. I want to be clear. I have no reason to doubt the facts of Mr. Tamayo's conviction, and as a former prosecutor, I have no sympathy for anyone who would murder a police officer, Kerry wrote. This is a process issue I am raising because it could impact the way American citizens are treated in other countries. District Judge Michael McSpadden signed Tamayo's death warrant despite Kerry's request. Appeals by Mexico's Foreign Affairs Ministry to Governor Rick Perry and Attorney General Greg Abbott asking them to stay Tamayo's execution went unheeded. Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesman Jason Clark said he met with Tamayo in his cell the morning of his execution. Clark said Tamayo told him he was ready to go. 20 years is too long. When asked about the possibility of a stay, Tamayo shrugged and said, that afternoon, a federal judge rejected a civil suit filed by Tamayo's lawyers. Their appeals to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court were denied. As Tamayo's execution date drew nearer, the case had escalated from a local Texas murder trial to a global controversy involving treaties, diplomacy, and human rights. At its core lay a fundamental question. Should Texas, in the name of justice for Officer Gatis, proceed with an execution despite international condemnation, or should it honor its treaty obligations and reconsider Tamayo's case in light of the Vienna Convention? On January 22, 2014, after decades of legal battles and international debates, Edgar Tamayo's fate was finally sealed. The place was the Huntsville unit in Texas, a prison infamous for being the site where the state carries out its executions. On that evening, as the sun fell and night closed in, the atmosphere inside the prison was tense yet procedural. An air of inevitability hung in the chamber. Texas had abolished the practice of granting inmates a special last meal back in 2011, following criticism that the tradition was being abused. Because of this, Tamayo was given no choice. He ate the standard prison meal that evening, a plate indistinguishable from what was served to any other prisoner. For a man facing his last hours on earth, the blandness of this final meal stood in stark contrast to the drama and intensity of the moment. As the scheduled hour for execution drew closer, there was one final twist. Tamayo's attorneys filed a last-minute round of appeals. These legal maneuvers bought him about 3 extra hours of life. During this time, officials, family members of Officer Gatis, and Tamayo's own witnesses sat in suspense, waiting to hear whether a court would intervene. But just as with every appeal before, the efforts collapsed. Texas, unwavering in its stance, announced the execution would move forward. At approximately 9:20 p.m., Tamayo was strapped onto the gurney inside the execution chamber. When asked if he had any last words, he said, "No." A single needle delivered pentobarbital, the drug Texas had used in dozens of executions. Witnesses described the process as quiet and efficient. The drug coursed through his veins and within minutes, his breathing slowed. At 9:32 p.m., Tamayo was pronounced dead. Inside the chamber, members of Officer Gatis's family were present. For them, this moment was not about politics, treaties, or international law. It was about closure. They had waited 15 long years since the night Officer Gatis was gunned down, and though nothing could bring him back, Texas had given them what it called justice. Outside, however, the reactions were more divided. To the Mexican government and international observers, the execution represented a defiance of international law, a refusal to honor obligations under the Vienna Convention. To Texas officials and supporters of the death penalty, it was the fulfillment of justice long delayed. Thus, Tamayo's execution was not simply the end of one man's life. It was the culmination of years of courtroom battles, political tensions, and ethical debates. It marked a point where international law clashed with state authority, and where human rights advocates collided with those demanding retribution. For some, it was a tragedy compounded by injustice. For others, it was justice finally delivered. Now it's your turn. What are your thoughts on the case of Edgar Tamayo and the execution that followed? Do you think justice was served, or do you feel there were deeper issues at play? We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. And before you go, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss more jaw-dropping true crime stories coming your way.